Hi, welcome back to day one of the NANOG82 program. I'm Chris Woodfield. I'm a member of the NANOG program committee and a senior staff network engineer with Twitter. I will be your session moderator for the next 100 minutes, speaking to you from Seattle, Washington. This afternoon, we are featuring 3 more great talks, and before we start, here are some important announcements. Reminder to please take a few moments at the conclusion of today to complete the Monday survey. You will find all the meeting surveys at nanog.org/surveys. And please use the chat window for general conversations with other attendees. Questions for the speaker should be entered into the Q&A tab of the chat box. If you need assistance with any technical issues, you can use the Help tab. Additionally, presentation slide decks can be found on the agenda if you would like to follow along. With that, let's continue our program. I would like to introduce Craig Labovitz, who will be presenting Tracing DDoS End-to-End in 2021. Craig is a CTO at Nokia Deepfield and is talking to us today from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Craig has been contributing to NANOG since NANOG 1 held in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1994, but has been presenting to multiple tech events long before NANOG was formed. Since then, he's spoken at NANOG 16 times and is a valuable contributor to this organization and our community as a whole. Welcome back to the NANOG stage, Craig.
Well, thank you for that introduction. My name's Craig Labovitz, and I'm the CTO for Nokia Deepfield. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, I work for a router vendor that also provides anti-DDoS. And secondly, I won't be naming individual ISPs or cloud providers today unless they explicitly advertise their DDoS and IPHM or IP header modification services. And I'm not naming them for really 2 reasons. One is that it's often hard to tell motive, whether it is actually malicious intent or it's inadvertent or ignorance and they're not aware of their customers. And secondly, I don't think it is the most important factor. The important factor is that as a community, it is relatively straightforward to detect, to filter and block and stop spoofed traffic, which constitutes the large share of DDoS today. And as a community, it really is a community effort. With DDoS booters, they are constantly changing ASN, constantly changing names, and so on. So this talk really came out of frustration. Frustration that we are still having the same conversations 20, 25 years later about really unsophisticated, stupid IPHM reflection DDoS. Well, this isn't all of DDoS. It is, by frequency and aggregate volume, the vast majority of DDoS. And the frustration is there's no good reason for this. This traffic is relatively easy to detect and to block. And, out of frustration, we decided to spend a bit of time and effort and see if we could actually understand where this spoofed traffic was coming from and trace it back through the internet. And indeed, as I'll share in the rest of this talk, you can. We went through, again, steps I'll talk about in the upcoming slides, and really identified 50 or so companies that today are generating the vast majority of spoofed, amplified TCP reflection and spoofed DDoS. So we'll share a little bit about the techniques we did. We'll show how you can use most routers today from all vendors to block the vast majority of DDoS. And we've got recommendations for vendors. So a quick bit of introduction. There are really 4 vectors for DDoS. The first 3 vectors all rely on the ability to do high-speed spoofing of the source address. For amplification, TCP, SA, SYNAC, and IPHM flood, the attacker spoofs the source address of the victim, bounces it off of amplifiers, and achieves a 500, 1,000x amplification going to the victim. In the third flavor, it is just fully spoofed, typically your SYN, your reset attacks, and others. Botnets are absolutely part of DDoS, but they aren't the most significant portion today, and likely I probably deserve the talk of their own in the future. So when you actually look at the DDoS ecosystem, it primarily tends to be today gamers and extortion attempts. Gamers and extortion are not super hackers. What they're doing is they're using, give or take, about 100 or so commercial booter services. These are services that advertise and offer discounts and referrals and provide a range of DDoS options for give or take about $50 to $100 US per month. In turn, the DDoS booters rely on a fairly small number of hosting. These hosting companies tend to be specialists. They also tend to advertise, though some less directly than others, where the stressors will run on the different servers. And for example, PlexWeb is one that advertises, though ignore all DMCA requests. They provide high-speed spoofing. In turn, the spoofers tend to rely, for most attacks, on amplification or reflection, millions, particularly DNS and DP, and to a lesser degree, LDAP and Memcache and other services, all generating the 1 to 3 terabits attacks that we see reported today. And this is just an example of one of the booters. All the panels start to look a lot alike. Generally, the prices are about $50 to $100 a month for the basic plan. If you want to rent a botnet, that gets into the hundreds of dollars. But UDP and TCP, SYNAC, and UDP flood attacks are relatively cheap. As you'll see in the panel here, it helpfully provides a number of spoof options. You can spoof DigitalOcean, Linode, Rackspace as your source, and generally offering 20 or 30 servers, give or take, amongst the, again, IPHM or IP header modification hosting. Generally, the claims range from hundreds of gigabits to, in this case, Hard Stressor and others will advertise 2 terabits or your money back for attacks. And, you know, when you actually look into who's actually offering the underlying hosting, it really tends to be 2 areas. One is there's a range of companies like privacy servers that explicitly advertise, generally based in gray area, Eastern European, and sort of other like jurisdictions. In the reference section at the end, we have a couple of pointers to the overlap with the bulletproof hosting market, which also talks about these jurisdictions. For other of the hosters, they tend to be layered behind multiple layers of ASN, like hosting domains and ownership to try to obfuscate, or they hide in sort of an infrastructure as a service provider or multiple layers of hosting. So the one on the left is absolutely explicit about what they do. The one on the right is a little more mysterious. They both advertise they're the leader in DDoS mitigation services, and it turns out we see huge, significant share of DDoS originating from the same hosting company. So the overall problem today is not a technology problem. It is a technology problem in the sense that the number of amplifiers is growing, driven by IoT. The number of botnets is growing because IoT and cloud. And DDoS and BPS rates are growing because, well, 1 and 2, and you can make money. But at the end of the day, this is an economic problem. When it costs $50 to launch a 2 terabit DDoS attack, and you can obtain 10,000 in extortion, that's an arbitrage. And that money will continue to drive the ecosystem unless we change the economics. And this talk really is about ways that we can identify, track, and identify where the IPHM is coming from and what we can do to help mitigate it. And the final graph on this slide really is showing the growth, right? This problem is not getting better. It's getting worse. When we look at aggregate spoofed traffic over the last year, we saw it basically double in size for the average peaks we saw across our sample study. So, there's really 6 ways to address the sort of DOS economic problem. One way is fix amplifiers, patch all the botnets, and, worthy cause, we should do it, but it's somewhat of a lost cause over the last 25 years. Law enforcement, and if you read PACER documents, constant churn of bot takedowns, DDoS hosting, Krebs articles, all document and chronicle this. We also have seen, a number of hardware vendors all offering specialized kit. All of that works. But again, the problem isn't technical. There's lots of vendors today. We all know how to block DDoS. The challenge is how do you change the economics when the attackers, it's free or $50 to the millions of dollars spent on DDoS? Well, this talk really is about the last 2, but clearly cloud and CDN offer a huge amount of scale and have played a huge role in mitigating DDoS for a large number of companies. But largely this talk is about we need to stop or change the economics of DDoS at the IPHM at the IPHM edge, where DDoS first enters the network as smooth traffic, as well as how we can leverage existing routers to better scale and block more economically within victim or downstream provider networks. So we decided to take the last year and decided to see if we could trace IPHM across the network. So we used, starting on the right, techniques similar to ITF dots and other sorts of fingerprint methods, where amongst a commercial base of deployed DDoS customers, we're able to get fingerprints of the attack as it arrived. We're then able to use that fingerprint and look for that traffic as that traffic arrives at the amplifiers and actually trace it all the way back, in most cases, in many cases, or maybe 40, 50% of cases, back to the original hoster. In other cases, we could get close to the regional transit, the national PTP in Eastern Europe where the traffic was originating. So again, really interesting ability to leverage commercial base and fingerprints to actually trace the traffic back across the network and try to quantify where is it entering. And this is kind of some examples of what that looks like. This is an example of a fingerprint as seen at the victim, starting, give or take about 7 p.m. in the local time zone. You'll see that traffic dropped, within the sheet offline for a period of several hours. This DDoS attack consisted of amplified DDoS, mostly fragments, from about 65,000 DNS amplifiers. And we'll look in the next slide. And by the way, I should mention that, what's interesting in this is the DOS attack, I think, was solved, but it likely was solved by the customer being black holed and all traffic being dropped to the customer. So this is actually, I think, the interesting bit. This is looking far upstream of that victim customer and applying the same DDoS hash amongst a range of different parts of networks and routers. What we found when we look at this hash and repeat this process over tens of thousands of attacks, we identify a fairly small number of hosting companies, regional transit, localized bits of the world where the attacks are originating. In this case, hosting provider 23, anonymized, was generating for the period about 14 million, two different sort of attack vectors, 14 million packets per second, about another 4 or 6 coming out of a regional provider. All told, just from this trace, 1 to 2 terabits of traffic going to the downstream. But again, we are able to identify the specific points in the network where the original spoofed traffic was entering. And we further, as I'll talk about in the next several slides, we're able to use fingerprints of the different booters and IPHM hosting to further narrow down the likely origin within regional transit and other provider networks. So this is just kind of a big picture view that is looking not just at the attack that we fingerprinted in the last 2 slides, but this is an aggregate view. This is looking at where does DDoS come from? And when you fingerprint the DDoS attacks back to the origin interfaces, origin hosting customers, it's not a huge number. Now, 50 is order of magnitude number. It might be 55, it might be 60, but it's not thousands. It turns out that the overall DDoS and even bulletproof hosting ecosystem is not huge. It really is specialized providers offering these services. And again, we can't attribute motive. Some of these are advertising. Some of these clearly are in the business. I'm curious whether this is intentional or inadvertent, leaving BCP 38 off, and they have some bad customers. But as I said, we wanted to be able to not only use sort of IPFix and NetFlow to trace DDoS back to the origin, but because we don't have complete coverage of the network, we wanted to be able to use other techniques like fingerprinting the booters to be able to get a better idea of likely origin within some of the networks where we did not have visibility. So it turns out for about the 100 or so commercial booters, they all have sort of distinct fingerprints. And what I mean by a fingerprint is when you build up a list of DNS amplifiers, of memcache amplifiers, of CLDAP, every list is slightly different. And in particular, what's really interesting is to look at the invalid IPs that are being used. because the invalid IPs really give an indication of when the list was collected. We actually, as Nokia, monitor and track all amplifiers and actually date when amplifiers enter or leave the internet. So amplifier IP list, really interesting way to identify, looking at flow or PCAPs of attacks, which amplifier, booter is being used. Similarly, when you use a DNS amplification payload for all records, you get to choose what domain name to query. In what I think may be an ironic choice, number of the booters have chosen peacecorps.gov as the name that they'll query to generate the amplified DNS. Similarly, many of the booters will use ICMP during attack to monitor. The choice of IPHM and others all identify. So all of these are techniques that when you look at live attacks, you can significantly narrow down the choice of booters. Though I will say many of the booters are actually the same company. They often, if you read some of the REST reports, will offer 5, 6 different companies with slightly different names. And there is absolutely a significant amount of code sharing and amplifier sharing. So it's sometimes hard to tell exactly when they're different companies and under different administrative control. So we want to be able to identify and fingerprint the actual booters. And I think we're able to do a fairly reasonable job of doing that. The other thing we wanted to do is, can we broadly detect when there is spoofed traffic occurring? And again, there are many papers cited in the reference that touch on different aspects of this. I don't think any one of these things is novel in itself. But the important bit, as I said earlier, is these are all queries that anyone from dozens of different vendors supplying flow tools or others, these are queries you can run in your network and identify the sources. It is absolutely the case that several of these hosting companies are customers of many of the NANOG attendees. So these are your customers. This is traffic that you can detect. And of course, the several ways that we use to detect this is, number one, looking at invalid or improbable port combinations. Now, this isn't 100%. Some CDN and others do interesting bits, but generally looking for Xbox as a source port and looking for traffic going to, DNS or Memcache or LDAP is generally pretty good if you see large volumes of traffic with these port combinations. It is almost, high probability representing spoofed or IPHM traffic. Similarly, a lot of IPHM uses really improbable header fields. These are crazy TTLs, sequence windows, TCP options, and so on. And in fact, TTL is really interesting. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. But again, this talk is not about theoretical DDoS. It's not about nation-state DDoS. This talk is about the vast majority of DDoS we see today that's taking customers offline, extortion attempts, gamers, things that are really causing pain. For the vast majority of spoofed traffic that we see, the TTLs are done really poorly. Normally, the internet has gotten really small. Content is not coming from thousands of locations. It is coming from CDN, pretty closely aligned to provider's edge network. What we're looking at in the left graph is the TTL we expect in a normal sort of consumer network. TTLs are normally coming pretty close around the original Linux, CP devices, Windows, and for whatever reason, CloudFront uses other TTL range. But again, pretty straightforward in TTL sort of distribution we see for traffic arriving in most consumer networks, Europe, US, Asia. On the right in red is what a DDoS looks like. This is randomized TTL with a 240 component. Again, this is really not hard to spot when spoofed traffic is arriving in a network to identify which customers, which interfaces, or which peers are originating the spoofed traffic. Similarly, when we looked at identifying where IPHM spoofed traffic was entering the network, we also looked at things like topology and CIDRs. And really, it's a combination of all of these techniques. A U.S. consumer provider is not originating traffic out of Asia, right? This is not, I think, super complicated but some very simple code analysis of IPFix provides really high classification of IPHM. And just for example, typical SYN floods, they will use and just sequentially iterate from 1 to 255, the entire V4 address space. And again, it really is, I think, IPHM that is the root of all this. There is botnets out there, but the vast majority of spoofed traffic, spoofed floods like this, where they're doing a SYN flood attack or a reflector attack, is all coming from a very small number of IPHM hosters. So I think we were able to successfully leverage DDoS fingerprinting. We're successfully able to track DDoS back across the network. We're able to leverage some IPHM detection techniques to identify the major hosters and to narrow down with the fingerprints where we thought the original DDoS was originating in the network. With all that said, we were left with a couple of mysteries. One of the mysteries is our amplifier lists are different from almost everything we see being used in attacks. We're never quite sure why. We also never quite understood why there was so much ICMP associated with DDoS. And lastly, when you actually look at the megabits per second, 50, 60 to 100 megapackets per second coming out of IPHM hosting, that has at least the potential of being 5x to get us into 10, 20 tera of DDoS potential traffic. Yet CloudFront and others who have done some nice blogs on this, we're still seeing really 2 to 3 being the high watermark. So the question is why? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that things like Memcached have gotten a lot harder. They're really, there are a lot of amplifiers out there, but they're not infinite. And particularly with Memcached, the number has gone down. The other thing that becomes clear is there absolutely are a number of providers who are rate limiting, policing, filtering URPF, and blocking traffic. From experience, where we obtained accounts on all the booters, they're notoriously unreliable, and most at once. It really is the aggregate IPHM capacity is quite large, but the booters are using, only portions of the infrastructure. The final, and I think somewhat interesting reason, is that when you look at the IPHM traffic, it usually is done really poorly. And by that, I mean about up to 50% or more of the amplifiers are invalid. And you'll see this if you look at any DDoS attack, whether it's using LDAP or NTP, and you see unreachable come back. It's a great hint that someone has an outdated list. So it's pretty clear, a fairly large number of the booters out there. This is not super sophisticated. This is not, high-end criminal gangs. This is, fairly low-level stuff that is able to generate multi-terabit attacks using shared code for, a few $100s a month on IPHM hosters, and $50 a month if you buy a stressor account. So I think one of the key messages from this talk is that particularly the spoofed IPHM DDoS problem is one that of economics. We need to do a better job of an industry of trying to block the original spoofed traffic before it arrives at the amplifiers. And the second part of this talk, as I wrap up, is that we also now have the ability, given the advances in routers and software using FlowSpec and NetConf, to block the vast majority of DDoS as it arrives at end networks, assuming upstream capacity. And we'll talk about in the next few slides, where the better part of the last 2 years have been spent working on bits of this technology. But it really is the case that amplifier attacks, super easy to block, and I think many ISPs are already blocking port and packet length combinations. But it turns out that you can also block the more complicated attacks. And typically, as I said, amplification attacks are really straightforward blockers. Many of you in NANOG already are. It turns out even SYN-ACK attacks, where the attacker will not amplify, but spoof the victim IP, bounce it off of Akamai, bounce it off of Google to hide the origins, and try to launch, again, sort of a TCP state flood attack against the end load balancer firewall. These attacks are also, I think, relatively straightforward to block with about 2,000 filters as well as the randomized flood attacks. I won't talk about botnets too much in this talk and save that for another to block, but also you can do a reasonably good job in about 2,000 filter entries. Traditionally, of course, the challenge is upstream, right? If you've got a 1 terabit link or, 100 gigabit link, 10 tera down, no router, no software in the world is clever enough to block it. But you can use routers to block traffic of your provider to downstream customers. Some of the challenges really are, of course, the upstream capacity. And it really is an issue now or a game of how many simultaneous attacks can you block. And, typically one of the issues for providers is safety. That is, does the guys who run the routers trust the security team to install filters? So there's organizational issues. There's always issues around the line speed impact. But, things have gotten a lot better in the last 5-10 years. And we have a number of customers, largely using just the routers to be able to block significant portions of DDoS traffic. So I'll wrap up with just kind of the last slide. It's been 25 years of the same attacks, giving the same types of talks about amplified DNS, amplified CLDAP. This is, a community problem. We're not going to solve this through law enforcement. We're not going to solve this through closing down all the booters and closing down all the hosting. Instead, there are really simple queries that all of you can run looking at TTL port combinations. Queries that will identify where spoof traffic is entering the network on its way to amplifiers. And these are queries you can gently share with your peers as you negotiate peering agreements and others. But as a community, we have the opportunity to block the vast majority of amplified DDoS. And lastly, we are working with a number of other vendors and other carriers. The technology is really so close with gRPC, IPFix, NetFlow, FlowSpec, combined with a number of vendors are working on much faster, whether it be gRPC or IPFix export of data, so we can detect and block DDoS much faster. We are still working with a number of vendors on low latency filter operations. How fast can you install and remove filters in response to dynamic and changing attacks? And lastly, happy to talk offline with folks. We're working within the ITF and other vendors, things like TTL, as I showed earlier, incredibly powerful if we could get TTL within FlowSpec, combined with a few other features like filtering order, prefix list, and so on. So that's a quick summary of the talk. I have a number of references at the end of the deck, and we'll be happy to answer just a few questions.
All right. Thank you, Craig, for your presentation. We have a few questions in the queue. The first one is actually my own question. While strict RPF is not an option for many ISPs to run against their customers, are there any providers actively examining flow data for large volumes of spoof traffic coming from their customers?
I think we have been working with some of our customers who are actively doing that. But I will say that there are a fair number of providers, as I mentioned in the talk, that aren't. I think part of the goal of this talk, again, is just to reiterate that there are some very basic queries that you can use with any NetFlow vendor using TTL, using CIDR to be able to see this stuff. And again, this is just, it's largely an economic problem as we continue to have this great disparity between the cost of DDoS and the scale of amplifiers.
Apologies for not having my phone on mute. One more question that I have in the queue. Do you publish the 2K filter?
So we are I don't know what you mean by publish 2K filter. The 2K filter will depend on the individual customer. So I think the way to think about the 2K filter is that the internet has gotten very small. If you have a subscriber or an enterprise customer, the range of the internet they actually interact with and the TTLs they'll use to interact with that rest of the internet is fairly narrow and can be captured in a fairly small filter set. Similarly, if you're running servers and getting TCP SYN-ACKs. So it really is the way to think of it perhaps is baseline. A baseline that combines topology, per customer TTL, and other information to form, essentially a filter list or a permit list that can be very, very effective for the vast majority of DDoS today.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question in the queue. We are often reluctant to name and shame. At what point does the time necessitate the need for, and if so, when is naming and shaming both necessary and helpful?
Well, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the challenge is that many of, the booters and the IPHM don't have a long shelf life. Many of them have a shelf life of 6 months to a year. In fact, during the study period, we obtained accounts, and maybe 30-40% of the accounts that we obtained at the start were no longer valid by the end, given both law enforcement action and some of them just disappeared. So the first order bit is that, there's a lot of flux, but, there does seem to be at any given time about 100 stressors and about 50 IPHM. And the focus really is structural. What can we do as an industry to detect and to block this? And if you just run or periodically some simple queries or build it into your peering agreements, this is not an intractable problem. There's 50 companies that are largely at any given time driving most of the world's DDoS. And at least half of them are customers of NANOG participants. So we have reached out to both our customers and other vendors and other ISPs where we've detected some of this traffic and are working them individually. But largely, this is a structural issue we should solve as a community and make sure we are applying BC38 and actively using basically any commercial netflow tool to look for this traffic. The final reason, as I said before, maybe the third reason, I'll have 4 before I'm done. The third reason is some of this may not be intentional. So some of this may be bad customers. We don't know motive with all of this. And finally, I do think there are some references at the end. So while we do provide some screenshots of names, there's also 10 or 12 different academic as well as industry papers we reference at the end that do enumerate different bits of the ecosystem. And again, this isn't really super hard. Many of these companies are advertising. It is relatively straightforward to get an account, get an IP address, and see who's hosting them, and understand what the AS paths look like to the network. So we are working with folks in the industry in sharing some of the information, but most of all, we'd like to see broader industry use some of these queries to be able to detect and to be able to police within their own networks.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of question time, so if you have any further questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Craig, if you're in the chat, feel free to answer them there. So right on time to move on to our next speaker.